Policemen/women of Reddit, what is the most horrifying situation you've been called to? I received a call about a missing child and rushed to the home, where I found the mother in a state of panic and unsure of what to do next. I immediately called for backup to help search the house and property. Taking charge of the search, I focused on the backyard, an expansive, wooded area with no visible fence. After about 10 minutes of searching, I came across the boy. He had gotten tangled in an old chain-link fence deep in the woods, hidden behind a cluster of trees, making it impossible to see from the house. It seemed he had been climbing on the fence, lost his balance, and gotten his hoodie caught, tragically strangling him. The hardest part for me was having to report the grim discovery over the radio, knowing the mother might overhear it through one of the other officers' radios inside. My company's driver, a former police sergeant, used to tell me stories on our early morning rides to the airport, the kind you couldn't escape, trapped in the car with nothing but the hum of the road and his quiet, matter-of-fact voice. One morning, he told me about a suicide call he'd responded to years before. A local farmer had locked himself in a shed and used a shotgun. The act itself didn't shake him. He'd seen worse, learned to detach. But what stuck with him, what burrowed into him, was what he found beside the body. Nearly 2 packs worth of cigarette butts scattered on the ground. The sergeant wasn't a man prone to dwelling, but that detail wouldn't let go. He kept picturing the farmer sitting there in the dim, dusty shed, smoking one after another, the gun across his lap. How long had he waited? An hour? 2? Turning it over in his mind, wrestling with it, the weight of that decision pressing down with each drag. It wasn't the blood, the violence, the mechanics of death that haunted him. It was the before. The quiet, solitary torment of a man counting down his last moments, surrounded by nothing but his own thoughts and the ashes of 40 cigarettes. After that, the sergeant found himself thinking about it at random times, standing in line at the store, staring at his dinner, lying awake at night. The image wouldn't leave. He started crying without warning. The department made him see a counselor. He told me all this calmly, eyes on the road, as dawn light crept over the fields. And for the rest of the drive, neither of us said a word. My mother was a police officer in the UK during the 1980s, back when the job was rougher, the rules looser, and the stories wilder. She only left the force after breaking her back in an accident. Otherwise, she'd have kept at it for years. One of her more memorable calls was a domestic disturbance. Neighbors reported screaming, things breaking, the usual. But when she arrived, the scene was anything but. The husband was sprawled in the hallway, groaning, a screwdriver buried deep in his ear. Turns out his wife had just found out he was cheating. In a rage, she grabbed the nearest tool and stabbed him in the side of the head. Not just a quick jab, either. Witnesses said she twisted it, like she was trying to scramble his brains right there in the hallway. Miraculously, he survived. But my mother never forgot the sight. This man writhing on the floor, a Phillips head sticking out of his skull like some grotesque DIY project gone wrong. She told me the story years later, shaking her head. Some people, she said, really take till death do us part as a challenge. And yeah, that one sticks with me too. This isn't my story, but it's my dad's. He was a cop and was the first responder to a horrific accident. A young girl had been speeding and hit 4 other girls, sending them flying a significant distance. 2 of the girls were dead on arrival, and when my dad arrived at the scene, he saw that one of the victims was my sister. Thankfully, my sister survived, but she was badly injured. My dad spent 25 years on the force and witnessed a lot of terrible things, but he always says that day was the worst of his entire career. We responded to a car accident where an SUV had run off the road at high speed, crashing into a ditch and flipping end over end several times. Inside the vehicle was a family of 4. The father, who was unbelted, was ejected through the windshield and, tragically, the vehicle landed on top of him before continuing to flip. From his position and the extent of his injuries, we surmised he died instantly. He was dead when we arrived at the scene. The mother, in the passenger seat, was wearing her seatbelt, but it seemed to have malfunctioned, we think, and didn't hold her in place. She was thrown forward far enough, or the windshield was pushed back enough, that her head struck the glass with enough force to create a hole in it. She was still alive when we arrived, but barely. The vehicle was a mangled wreck, and we couldn't get her out quickly. We worked a trauma code on her right there in the seat, doing everything we could, intubating, starting 4 lines, and more. By the time the rescue squad was able to access the vehicle and remove her, she had been without a pulse for nearly 10 minutes. The second unit continued CPR on her during transport to the ER, but she was declared dead shortly after arriving at the hospital. In the back seat were 2 children, a 12-year-old girl and an 8-year-old boy. They were both properly restrained and, aside from some scrapes and bruises, didn't appear seriously injured. Their vitals were stable, and although they were in shock, they seemed alert. Because it was so difficult to get into the car, they had a clear view of everything we were doing to try to save their mother. Given her condition, we focused our main efforts on getting her out first. The children were eventually removed safely and transported a little after she had been taken out. They were brought to the same ER as their mother, with the girl transported in our ambulance. Once there, the children were thoroughly checked for any internal injuries or anything we might have missed. Thankfully, they didn't have any significant injuries. What stuck with me the most came later, as we were restocking our unit. One of the cops told us that the family was from out of town, several hours away, and had been on vacation. The closest relatives wouldn't be able to get to the hospital for at least 2 hours. Soon after hearing this, I was leaving the ER and looked into the room where the children had been placed after their trip to radiology. The 2 of them were lying together on the same bed. The girl had her arms wrapped around her little brother. Both of them had 1,000-yard stares, completely blank expressions. I don't know if anyone had told them about their parents, but by the looks on their faces, you could tell they knew. That image is burned into my memory. I often wonder how those kids turned out and how difficult their lives must have been after that day. This isn't my story, but it's about my dad, who has been an officer for 18 years. 3 years ago, he responded to a case where a boyfriend had brutally beaten a 2-year-old to the brink of death. My dad was the first to arrive at the house and stayed with the baby, holding them until the ambulance could get there. Sadly, the child passed away just minutes before help arrived. It hit my dad really hard. He's always had a soft spot for kids, and that case left him shaken. He ended up taking a short leave afterwards. Edit. He had vacation days saved up and took a week off to recover, as it deeply affected him emotionally. The call came in as a suicide attempt, a joint response with law enforcement. The individual was a tall, powerfully built woman, seemingly of Russian descent, around 6'1". Intoxicated, she had inflicted severe lacerations on her left forearm. As we attempted to restrain her, her strength and surprising flexibility became immediately apparent. I found myself holding her bleeding left arm, the slickness of blood making it difficult to maintain a grip even through my gloves. The open wounds were disturbingly palpable beneath my fingers as she twisted her arm violently, fighting against our hold. A chilling declaration ripped from her throat, a guttural scream of "My victory will be glorious," followed by an unsettling, almost animalistic cackle. While I struggled to secure her injured arm, she abruptly fell silent. Her gaze locked onto mine, a sudden shift in focus as she asked, her voice strangely calm amidst the chaos, "Where did you get those green eyes?" By this point, she was on a stretcher, surrounded by a significant number of police officers and firefighters, at least 6 to 8. Some of the officers, lacking gloves, were hesitant to handle her bloodied arm. With a disconcerting slowness, she began to overcome my hold. In what felt like slow motion, her hand reached towards the zipper of my pants. My own hands were slick with her blood, hindering my ability to stop her. She managed to unzip them, but I pressed myself back against the ambulance wall, limiting her access to just the tips of her fingers as she strained to reach inside. We eventually succeeded in fully restraining her, but the call remains etched in my memory. The officers echoed the sentiment. Despite the often grim nature of our work, this particular incident stood out. For me, the visceral sensation of my fingers inadvertently probing the open wounds on her arm is an image that continues to linger. I've been in law enforcement for a long time, and over the years, I've encountered some of the worst individuals our society has to offer. On the other hand, I've also been fortunate enough to cross paths with some of the kindest, most generous people. The story I'm about to share may not be the most extreme or graphic thing I've experienced, but it has haunted me the most. It's the one that replays in my mind, the one that gives me nightmares. Talking about it helps a little, so when I see questions about impactful moments in my career, I often find myself sharing this one. A family of 5 tragically lost their lives in a horrific car accident. They were driving down the interstate when a vehicle traveling in the opposite direction swerved into their lane, crossing the median and crashing into them. The impact shoved their SUV into the car next to them. This all happened in a split second. The collision caused their vehicle to burst into flames. The only way out was through the back hatch, as the left doors were crushed by the vehicle that crossed the median, and the right side was smashed by the car they were trying to pass. The father, who was driving, died instantly. The mother succumbed to smoke inhalation. It's heartbreaking to think that, had she been able to escape, she might have survived. The 2 daughters, the oldest and the youngest, were found near the back of the SUV. The oldest daughter had her hand on the hatch release, but both girls died from smoke inhalation. It was clear the mother had done everything she could to help them, as she was found in a position that suggested she had just helped the youngest into the hatch area. The son, sitting in the front seat, also died from smoke inhalation, though his injuries from blunt force trauma and burns would have likely been fatal regardless. This might not have been the most disturbing thing I've ever dealt with, but it's certainly the most traumatic. I hope I never have to witness anything like it again. I was deeply affected by this for a long time afterward. This family was on their way to visit their son at the local university. They were only 2 miles from their exit when the accident happened. I volunteered to go with the chaplain to give the son the tragic news. This young man lost his entire family in an instant. He shared with me that the last thing he had said to his mom was, "Don't come down here, none of my friends' families visit them, and you'll just embarrass me." He was devastated. To this day, I stay in touch with him, and he has become like another son to me. The lesson here is simple. Folks, life can change in the blink of an eye. No matter the arguments, the frustrations, always take the time to remind your loved ones that you care. Hug them, kiss them, embrace them. I've seen it too many times. Things can be over before you even realize it. Never take them for granted. My cousin, who also works in emergency services, responded to a call that has stayed with him. It was a reported suicide. A man had apparently taken an overdose several days prior, 3 or 4, as they later determined. He had gone to bed with his electric blanket on. The image my cousin recounted was horrific. When they attempted to move the man from the bed, his body had begun to decompose significantly due to the delay in discovery and the heat from the electric blanket. Tragically, according to my cousin, the structural integrity of his back had so deteriorated that, upon lifting him, his internal organs were expelled through the collapsed tissue. It was a scene that profoundly impacted him. A friend of mine who works in law enforcement responded to a disturbance call in a neighborhood known for frequent issues. What began as a heated argument took a gruesome turn. One of the individuals involved escalated the situation horrifically. He went upstairs to his residence, put a pan of oil on to heat, and then returned downstairs to knock on the door. When his adversary answered, he threw the boiling oil directly into the man's face. My friend described the injuries as extensive third-degree burns. He also mentioned that the acrid smell of cooked human tissue was the most sickening odor he had ever encountered in his career. I once interviewed a police lieutenant for a local paper, and he shared a chilling tale with me. It was Halloween in a college town when the police received a call about a fight breaking out in the front yard of a frat house. As they arrived and pushed through the growing crowd, the situation escalated quickly. In the chaos, one of the kids shoved another into the street, right into the path of an oncoming speeding truck. The lieutenant described it as something he'd never forget. The impact was so violent, the kid basically exploded. It was, according to him, the most gruesome scene he'd ever witnessed on the job. The man I work for is a retired police officer, and there's one incident that continues to haunt him. He received a call reporting what sounded like gunshots at a private residence. Upon arriving at the scene and entering the house, he was confronted with a horrific sight: a man who had died by suicide, having used a 12-gauge shotgun. As devastating as that was, the full extent of the tragedy soon unfolded. Further inside the house, he discovered the bodies of the man's children, each with gunshot wounds to their backs, and the man's wife, also with a fatal wound to her back. It became clear that the man had murdered his entire family before taking his own life. My boss was profoundly shaken by the discovery. The chief of police, recognizing the gravity of the situation, immediately granted him the remainder of the day off. I wasn't the one at the scene, but a family friend of mine, who used to be an ambulance driver, shared this story with me. One night, he got a call about a car accident involving a drunk driver. When he arrived, he and his team began checking the wreckage, and it didn't take long for them to realize the 2 men in the front seat were dead. As they worked their way to the back seat, he noticed one of the passengers, a young woman, was his own daughter. She was dead, too. That experience haunted him deeply. He took some time off to process everything, and when he finally returned to work a couple of months later, he couldn't bring himself to drive an ambulance anymore. Instead, he worked in the ER for a few years. He loved being behind the wheel, though, and after about 4 or 5 years, he requested to return to the ambulance crew. On his second day back on the job, they got another call about a car crash. He rushed to the scene and immediately recognized his son's car, which had crashed into a tree. His son was dead on impact. The sight of what was left of him completely broke the man. Not long after, his wife and remaining daughter had him committed to a mental hospital, where he's been ever since. Responding to a call in the early hours, we learned a man had been arrested for going equipped for theft. Later, his mother came to the station asking about his children. This was news to us. He hadn't mentioned any kids. I was dispatched to his residence and called out through the letterbox. There was no response. I tried again, and a small, 3-year-old boy cautiously opened the door. He didn't have a key, and when I asked if he was alone, he told me his 18-month-old brother was inside with him. 2 young children, a 3-year-old and an 18-month-old, had been left alone in the house for what must have been the entire night. Given the circumstances, we had a force entry. The scene inside was appalling, a level of squalor that continues to disturb me. Dirty diapers were scattered everywhere, mixed with discarded takeout containers and piles of filthy clothing. The 18-month-old's diaper was so full it had leaked up his back. We managed to contact their grandmother, who came to collect them. While waiting, I tried to find a clean cup to give them a drink and some bread for toast, as it was clear they hadn't eaten. Every cup I found was covered in mold, and the only food available was tinned beans. Even getting them a drink of water seemed risky due to the unsanitary conditions. We eventually got a sealed bottle of water from a nearby shop. After the children were safely with their grandmother, we conducted a thorough search of the house. The state in which those poor kids were living was heartbreaking. They shared a single bed. The bathroom hadn't been cleaned in what looked like years. In the father's bedroom, we discovered a cannabis grow operation set up in a small tent, a significant fire hazard that could have had devastating consequences for the children. We dismantled the setup and bagged everything as evidence. As I went through the house turning off electrical appliances, I noticed his computer was running. When I moved the mouse to shut it down, his desktop wallpaper was a picture of a young girl, appearing to be around 12 or 13 years old, naked. I have rarely felt such a potent mix of disgust and anger towards one individual. The way he chose to live was shocking enough, but forcing his young children to endure such a deplorable and dangerous environment is beyond comprehension. This isn't my experience, but it's a story my dad, a firefighter, has shared. On his very first day on the job, the crew responded to a call about a potential suicide. A woman was reportedly threatening to set her house on fire. When my dad and the other firefighters finally entered the residence, they found her on the top floor, standing in the center of a room, completely soaked in gasoline. Before they could intervene, she ignited herself. Flames erupted instantly, engulfing her. They managed to extinguish the fire and get her out alive, but she had sustained severe burns across her body. The reason behind her desperate act was heartbreaking. Her boyfriend had broken up with her. It was a stark and traumatic introduction to the realities of his new profession. This isn't my personal story, but it's one that definitely deserves to be shared. I was in 11th grade when a local woman came to speak at our school about the dangers of drunk driving. To a group of teenagers who thought we already knew all there was to know about it, it seemed like a waste of time. The woman began by telling us about her daughter, who had pulled over to the side of the road after getting a flat tire. She was on the phone with her dad, asking for help, when suddenly the line went dead. A drunk driver had swerved his 18-wheeler off the road and hit her. The impact was so severe that her head was found more than 200 yards away from her body. I couldn't hold back the tears. I sobbed like I've never sobbed before. The assembly ended, and we were supposed to head to our next class, but I couldn't stop crying. I left the room, wandered back to the dimly lit assembly hall, and there she was, sitting alone, packing up her things. I walked up to her, hugged her, and just broke down. We sat there, cried together for about 10 minutes. She cried, I cried, and we shared that moment of grief. She told me that if her story convinced just one person to never drive drunk, then sharing her pain had been worth it. From that day forward, she came to every home football game I played in throughout high school. She wore my jersey number, sat with my parents, and cheered us on. Win or lose, she always gave me a hug at the end of each game. To this day, I've never driven after drinking, and I never will. My mom, who worked as an EMT for several years, once responded to a call about a seemingly deceased homeless individual. When she and her partner arrived, they found the man alive and conscious, though in dire condition. The shocking discovery was the state of his foot. It was severely infected and infested with maggots, completely covered, with the bone visible beneath the writhing mass. It was a gruesome sight, a stark reminder of the harsh realities faced by those living without shelter and access to basic medical care. While not a police story, this incident profoundly impacted my dad, a volunteer firefighter since the 1990s and still active after over 40 years at 63, and his close friend. Their station received a call for a severe accident. A fully loaded semi-truck carrying sugar beets had run a red light, colliding with a Geo Metro in the intersection. At the time, the protocol involved a designated team collecting the fire trucks from the station, while others, like my dad and his friend, who lived nearby, would drive their personal vehicles directly to the scene with their gear. This particular intersection, a main one close to both their homes, meant they were the first to arrive. Tragically, the driver of the demolished car was my dad's friend's mother. He arrived to the horrifying reality of his own mother having been decapitated in the wreckage. Understandably, my dad's friend resigned from the fire department soon after. The department's policy regarding the initial response to calls was subsequently revised, mandating that all personnel report to the station first before proceeding to the scene. I started as a ride-along during the academy in the summer of 2006. We had to complete a couple of 100 hours as part of the program. The academy was affiliated with a college, so the requirements were a bit different, but we still got post-certified. The first day I showed up for my ride-along, the officer I was paired with immediately flashed me a grin. It wasn't the kind of smile you want to see. "Come on, man. Let's go," he said, and I could tell right away something was off. This all took place in a small town in Idaho, what locals call the Potato State. It's usually quiet, with the occasional drunk call and some drug activity, but this day was going to be different. When we arrived at the house, it had already been cordoned off. We walked inside, and the first thing I noticed was the blood. There was blood everywhere. The crime scene techs, CSTs, had already been through, gathering what they needed, so we didn't have to be overly cautious about where we stepped, other than protecting our own clothes and shoes. As we moved through the house, it looked as though someone had taken a paint roller, dipped it in red paint, and sprayed it around with an air compressor. The blood splatter was on every surface except for the kitchen and dining room. The smell hadn't quite set in yet, since it had only happened shortly before we arrived, as I later found out. We eventually made our way to the basement, and that's where the real horror was. The scene, there was like something out of Nightmare. Puddles of blood on the floor that looked like tomato soup, with rice mixed in, and more blood splatter on the walls. Here's what happened. The husband had discovered his wife had been cheating on him. In a fit of rage, He went to his buddy's house and borrowed a shotgun. Afterward, he stopped for breakfast at a local restaurant, then returned home. When his wife answered the door, he shot her point blank in the chest. It was brutal, like something out of a Tarantino film, though he was closer to the mark with the gore than you might think when it's point blank. He then walked down the hall, killing his kids in their rooms. The wife's lover confronted him in the hallway, and he shot him point blank as well. Finally, he went down to the basement, turned on the radio, and shot himself in the head. I specifically remember the radio because when we entered the basement, it was playing softly in the background. The CSTs had left it on, and there was no reason to turn it off. To this day, I can't hear If You're Going Through Hell by Rodney Atkins without those memories coming rushing back. My paramedic brother-in-law was recently called to an incident involving an intoxicated man who had seriously injured himself. When he arrived on scene, he saw a person standing next to a house, leaning limply, with his friends gathered around him. At first glance, it seemed odd. This guy was completely unconscious, yet still somehow standing, which was incredibly confusing. Then the details started to come into focus. The man had gotten really drunk and thought it would be a brilliant idea to jump off the roof of the house and land over the fence in the neighbor's garden. The problem? The fence wasn't your average garden fence. It was made of chicken wire, supported by star pickets, which are these long metal spikes with 3 sharp ends that look like stars. The man jumped, but instead of landing safely, he came down hard on one of the star pickets, which impaled him between his genitals and anus, and the spike went all the way up to his collarbone. He had to be carefully cut down and kept alive for 3 days before eventually passing away. The doctors didn't attempt to remove the spike, likely because of its size and shape. The X-ray of the injury was absolutely horrific to see. This isn't my personal story, but it's the most horrifying one I've ever heard, and I've even seen pictures of it. My instructor at the police academy shared it with us one day. He had us huddle together and asked, "Want to hear the worst thing about our jobs?" He's a sheriff's deputy, and this incident happened when he was responding to a car accident. Where we live, if a deputy is the first on the scene, that usually means the accident is way out in the middle of nowhere. And this one definitely was. It took him a while to find the crash site because the 2 cars had collided head-on and both headlights were out. Finally, he spotted a man covered in blood, waving him down. The man was the driver of one of the cars, a black Tahoe. He had been drinking and had his whole family in the car. The driver was frantic, saying he was looking for his daughter. His girlfriend and 2 other kids were strapped in and had only minor injuries, but they couldn't find the oldest daughter. The driver of the other car, who was also later found to be drunk, had a bad gash but was otherwise okay. The deputy, who was the only responder at that point, started searching for the missing girl. He searched the area near the wreck, but found nothing. Finally, when the wind died down, he said he could hear a sound that sounded like a kitten in a blender. It was the daughter. She had been unbelted and was thrown from the car during the crash. The impact had launched her off the road, and she ended up in a nearby field where she landed in a barbed wire fence. The deputy took out his multi-tool with wire cutters, but every time he cut a piece of the wire, it just seemed to get tighter. He managed to free her, and as the first fire trucks and ambulance arrived, he ran with her in his arms toward them. Unfortunately, within the 30 or so feet he had to run, the little girl passed away. It's one of those stories that stays with you. My dad served as a police officer for 25 years, and these are the three stories he recounts most often when people inquire about his time on the force. His very first call as a deputy involved a deceased individual and a shooting. As a trainee, his role was primarily observational. They arrived at what appeared to be a large family gathering or barbecue, only to discover the body on the lawn of the adjacent property. Through interviews with people at the party, they pieced together what had happened. Two brothers who lived at the residence had gotten into an argument. In a fit of anger, one brother drew a gun and fired it into the ground. Tragically, the bullet struck a hidden rock, ricocheted upwards, and struck his brother in the pelvis. The impact severed a major artery, and he bled to death while running. The brother who fired the shot was inconsolable, explaining that he had chased after his brother, trying to help, but his brother looked terrified, an image that would forever be etched in his memory. The second story takes place while he was on patrol in Compton. He noticed a car idling near a stop sign and approached to investigate. As he got closer, he saw that all the car windows were smeared with blood, and there was a man in the driver's seat. Upon opening the door, he found the driver naked, covered head to toe in blood, and clutching a large pair of fabric shears. When my dad asked if he was okay, the man began to explain that he couldn't stop a buzzing noise, so he had cut off his ears. He was, my dad realized, heavily under the influence of PCP. My dad calmly asked him to step out of the vehicle, called for an ambulance, and the man was taken for medical attention. Interestingly, my dad noted that individuals high on PCP were often surprisingly compliant if approached slowly and spoken to calmly. He contrasted this with people on a speedball, a mixture of heroin and cocaine, who he described as fighting with incredible ferocity, sometimes to the point of tendons tearing. The third story is particularly disturbing, so please be warned if you're sensitive to such details. After 2 years working in sex crimes and crimes against children as a detective, my dad requested a transfer following his response to the murder of an infant. The father had grabbed the baby by the ankles and brutally smashed the child back and forth against the corner of a wall until every bone was broken. The man was not under the influence of drugs or alcohol. He was, in my dad's words, simply evil. This case was so horrific that it ultimately led him to seek a different assignment within the department. Yes, fire rescue certainly counts. My dad and 2 of my uncles, all part of the local fire rescue, were called out one winter to recover a body from the major river near our town. Tragically, it was my grandfather. He had taken his own life by jumping off the bridge after losing his job during the recession. The scene was devastating for them. One of my uncles vomited at the sight. The other had to be immediately helped to the shore, overwhelmed by the horror. My dad, ever the stoic one, tried to maintain composure to support his brothers throughout the ordeal. However, the moment we walked through our front door, the tough facade crumbled. I witnessed the strongest man I knew, my dad, collapse onto the floor, sobbing uncontrollably. All 3 of them have expressed that nothing in their years of service has ever been more shocking, horrifying, or profoundly traumatizing than pulling their own father's cold, bluish-purple body from the icy river. The personal connection to the victim amplified the inherent tragedy in a way they had never experienced before. A few years ago, while working in the trauma ICU, we received a patient who had attempted suicide with a gunshot to the head. His head was heavily bandaged, the dressings extending down to his neck. Before even speaking with his mother, he was taken to surgery simply to have the initial dressing changed. The details that emerged were unsettling. He had used a shotgun, walked deep into a nearby field, and shot himself. The point of entry was under his chin, but incredibly, the blast had completely missed his brain, essentially destroying his face. He then crawled through the field until someone discovered him by the roadside, an encounter that must have resembled a scene from a horror film. His CT scan revealed a facial structure so distorted it looked like something from a science fiction movie. He underwent an emergency tracheostomy at the scene. His mother, after understanding the extent of his injuries, made the difficult decision to withhold the placement of a PEG tube for feeding and to forego any reconstructive surgeries. She explained that the surgical process would have been lengthy and agonizing, and that her son had suffered from long-standing unhappiness and depression, ultimately desiring to end his life. This patient required the most aggressive combination of pain and sedative medications I have ever witnessed. He was on 2 different sedatives at exceptionally high doses, one of which I haven't seen used since, a potent opioid and a paralytic agent. The paralysis was necessary because he would occasionally regain some level of consciousness and thrash violently, risking further injury. His ear canals were destroyed, rendering him deaf, and the extent of his facial trauma left him blind and unable to speak. Despite all this, he was breathing on his own with an oxygen collar, not requiring a ventilator. His death was a slow and agonizing process, taking 2 to 3 months. Essentially, he slowly starved while heavily medicated. The odor in the room was also profoundly disturbing. Due to the risk of hemorrhage, his bandages were infrequently changed, resulting in a pervasive, foul smell akin to rotting tissue. His mother remained by his side until his final moments, sleeping in his room. It was without a doubt one of the most harrowing and emotionally draining cases I have ever been involved in. During my time in the Citizens Police Academy, the dispatcher shared some of her most memorable calls, both positive and negative. This particular story was the one she described as her worst. A man called the police to report that his girlfriend had died by suicide. When officers arrived at the scene, they found the young woman deceased in the bathtub, having bled out. The subsequent interrogation of the boyfriend revealed a disturbing timeline. The girlfriend was pregnant, and the couple, both in their early 20s, did not want to have children at that time. Tragically, this was not the first time she had attempted to terminate a pregnancy. According to the boyfriend, she resorted to the same method they had used previously, a coat hanger. While he was occupied playing video games, she attempted the procedure. However, something went wrong, and she suffered fatal bleeding in the tub. It wasn't until some time had passed and he hadn't seen her that he went to check on her, only to find her dead. He then made the call to the police. In essence, she had inflicted the injuries herself, and while he was distracted, she bled to death. The dispatcher conveyed the profound sadness and preventable nature of this tragedy, emphasizing the isolation and desperation the young woman must have felt. I'm not a police officer, but for a school project, I had the opportunity to shadow one. He shared many stories with me, but there was one in particular that he said affected him deeply, more than any other in his career. It was a late-night call about a car that had gone off the highway. At the time, he had been a police officer for about 6 years and hadn't yet encountered anything particularly traumatic. Arriving at the scene, he realized he was the first emergency responder there, so he immediately took charge to assess the situation and call for the necessary resources. He approached the vehicle, expecting the damage to be relatively minor, as the exterior didn't appear too badly impacted. The car was on its side, but didn't look severely crushed. Given the safety features in modern vehicles, he initially thought everyone inside should be okay. He was partially correct. The car had been carrying 2 parents and 3 children. The parents had already managed to get out of the vehicle, but the children were nowhere to be seen outside. Bystanders who witnessed the crash had assisted the parents, who were in shock and disoriented, unable to explain what had happened to their car or their kids. The officer checked the interior of the vehicle for any signs of life, but found none. He immediately radioed for an urgent medical team, realizing it wouldn't be for all the children. One of the children was alive, but had a severe head wound and was unresponsive. However, he detected a faint pulse, knowing the child had very little time left. The other 2 children, tragically, had a different fate. The accident occurred when the family was traveling at 45 miles per hour on an off-ramp, having slowed down to exit the highway. One of their tires blew out, causing the mother to lose control, and the car flipped into a group of small trees. While the trees posed little resistance to the vehicle's momentum, the children seated near the windows were directly in the path of the impact. Their heads struck the trees with such force that the injuries were catastrophic. One child's head was almost completely gone, his face and brain matter scattered on the tree that hit him. The other child had some of his head remaining, but the tree had struck him in the neck and jaw, severing his head cleanly from his body. The child with the severe head laceration was the youngest and the smallest. The tree had just grazed the top of her head. Miraculously, she survived thanks to the swift and skilled work of the medical team. The parents and their surviving child were transported to the hospital. The officer I shadowed told me that even after 24 years, he still has vivid nightmares about that night. The sheer horror of the scene, especially the unimaginable injuries to the children, had a lasting and profound impact on him. This isn't my story, but it's one my dad, who served as a police officer for 27 years in the next town over, has shared. Our area had a fairly large airfield, so the sight of planes was commonplace. One day, my dad received a call reporting a plane crash. A Polish family visiting a doctor friend in the area had gone up for a flight and experienced engine failure about an hour into it. The small aircraft crashed with significant force onto the runway, which was slick from a recent snowfall. Tragically, everyone on board perished. However, a particularly heartbreaking detail was that a 6-year-old boy had accompanied the family, while his parents had remained on the ground. The impact of the crash had severed the boy's body in half at the waist due to the force of a seatbelt. My dad vividly recalls the profoundly distraught parents calmly removing their son's partially intact body from the wreckage, placing him in his car's seat, and insisting on taking him to the hospital. It's the most terrifying mental image I can possibly conceive. My dad was visibly shaken and emotionally affected for about a week following that incident. The sheer unnaturalness of the scene and the parents' heartbreaking denial left a deep impression on him. My uncle, who works in emergency services, once responded to a call about a man who had fallen from a significant height, around 6 stories. The details were gruesome. He had apparently slipped from a balcony, impacting the building on the way down. Part of his head struck the third level, and the rest of his body landed on the ground. The image that particularly disturbed my uncle was the thought of having to lift the deceased man, knowing that his skull was cracked open and his brain matter would likely spill out. The sheer fragility of life and the violent nature of the death deeply upset him. As a former detention officer, this is a story from my time working in the jail. It's something that has always stuck with me. I had just completed the morning routine of distributing single-bladed shaving razors to the inmates in medical solitary confinement when the control room radioed me. The inmates were requesting assistance because someone had cut themselves. Thinking it was likely a minor incident, I casually grabbed a Band-Aid and headed back to the medical solitary tank. Upon arriving, I unlocked and rolled open the doors to the tank. Immediately, the other inmates began yelling that Mark, we'll call him that, was in distress and needed help. His cell was number 10 out of 10 in the tank, placing it at the far end, directly across from cell number 5. I rushed to his cell, which had vertical bars spaced wide enough to easily fit an arm through. Mark was standing at his sink, facing the mirror, repeatedly muttering, "I gotta cut their name off my neck." He was also holding the single blade he had broken out of the razor casing. I started trying to get his attention by calling his name. I had established a decent rapport with him previously, hoping it would be helpful in this situation. Unfortunately, it did. Mark abruptly turned around, the blade in his hand, made direct eye contact with me, and in one swift motion, sliced himself from below his left ear down to the middle of his throat, all while continuing to repeat, "I gotta get this bitch's name off my neck." Due to the location of the cut and the fact that he had nicked his carotid artery, I was immediately sprayed across the face with arterial blood, which then splattered onto the walls of his cell. After a moment of shock at what I had just witnessed, I regained my composure and called for backup and an ambulance for a suicide attempt, although I strongly suspected his intent was to remove his ex-girlfriend's name, which I later learned he had tattooed on his neck. To make the rest of the initial incident brief, backup arrived, and we managed to wrestle Mark to the ground, secure the blade, and apply pressure to his neck while awaiting the paramedics. Mark was subsequently transferred to the North Texas State Hospital of Vernon for the criminally insane. Surprisingly, he was returned to the jail a few weeks later and attempted the same self-harm act 2 more times. Fortunately, he survived each instance. Several weeks later, once Mark was back on his medication and his condition had stabilized, he requested to speak with me in his new cell. This time, it was to sincerely apologize for getting his blood on me and to thank me for saving his life. He also felt it was important to personally inform me that he had hepatitis C, expressing genuine concern that he might have inadvertently harmed the person who had just saved him. I had already been tested and was relieved to find that I was Hep C negative. However, I deeply appreciated his concern at that point. For him to take the time and mental space to express all of that truly meant a lot to me. It showed a level of remorse and awareness that was unexpected given the circumstances. I'm not a police officer, but I was the person who stumbled upon a scene that I'll never forget. Thankfully, I was the one who called 911. When I was 15, I got a job at a fairly small mall for our town. It wasn't a strip mall. The stores were laid out in a kind of honeycomb shape, and in the middle of the honeycomb was a fountain, the kind you throw coins into for wishes, along with a courtyard with benches and tables. It wasn't a very busy mall, but it was big for our area. By the time this happened, I was almost 17. I was working a Saturday shift, just heading into my half-hour lunch break. I walked out of my store, and that day, the mall was pretty quiet. Since it was an outdoor mall, meaning you had to walk outside to get between stores, the chilly fall weather kept people inside. As I was walking to a nearby restaurant, I noticed a woman sitting on the edge of the fountain. It seemed odd to me because it was a little too cold to be sitting outside with your feet in the water, and that's usually what people did in the summer. I thought it was strange, but I kept walking, keeping an eye on her. Every now and then, she'd bend down and dip her hands in the water, almost like her upper body would sway side to side a little. I kept thinking, that's really weird. What is she doing? At that point, it all happened in less than a minute. The mall wasn't busy, and it doesn't take long to get from one side to the other. I heard a baby cry. That's when everything hit me like a ton of bricks. The woman had a baby. My mind clicked into overdrive, and I don't know why I did it, but I immediately turned around and ran toward her, dialing 911 as I sprinted. It felt like I reached the fountain in seconds, and as I got closer, I realized what was happening. She was trying to drown the baby. She didn't even acknowledge me when I grabbed the baby out of the water. She didn't move, didn't speak, didn't look at me. It felt like I was in some kind of nightmare. I was still on the phone with 911 when the police and ambulance arrived, less than 2 minutes later. They took over, and while they couldn't give me many details, they did tell me that the baby survived. Apparently, the mother had been dunking the baby under the water and pulling it up, not holding it under the entire time, which, thankfully, saved the baby's life. They arrested the woman, and the officer speculated that she was likely on drugs. It was the scariest moment of my life, and I still go to therapy for it. It helped me with a lot of other things, but that moment really messed me up for a while. Oh, and I should mention, I was 7 months pregnant at the time. Yeah. During one of my initial solo shifts, a call came in requesting assistance for EMS. Typically, these calls involve providing extra physical support, so I didn't anticipate anything too alarming. However, upon my arrival, the paramedics informed me that the front door was ajar and the interior hallway was saturated in blood. My immediate priority shifted to clearing the residence. Stepping inside, I observed that the back door was also open and various household items were strewn across the back patio. This immediately triggered concerns of a potential home invasion. I radioed dispatch for backup, but due to the high call volume, I was informed that no other units were available, a disconcerting piece of news. I was now faced with two possible paths, a hallway leading towards the garage or the blood-soaked hallway extending to the left. Knowing the injured individual was likely in the latter direction, I made the difficult decision to clear the rest of the house first, a nerve-wracking task with the possibility of encountering an unseen assailant lurking within. Adding to the tension was the sound of the victim's cries for help. Not a typical sharp scream of pain, but a weak, hoarse, and muffled sound. Upon reaching the end of the bloody hallway, I encountered two locked doors. She was behind one of them, potentially with the suspect, while the other remained silent. I ultimately had to force entry into both rooms, only to find her in one of them, alone. The scene was brutal. She had been viciously attacked, with extensive, deep lacerations covering her entire body. Despite the severity of her injuries, she was still alive. We managed to extract her from the house, and thankfully, she survived. The subsequent investigation revealed that the residence was overcrowded, housing 15 migrant workers in a 3-bedroom space. One of the workers had been recently terminated and had returned to the house seeking the supervisor, but encountered the victim instead. He had then assaulted her with a machete before fleeing the country directly to Honduras. The memory of her muffled screams and the sheer volume of blood remains vivid and disturbing. It was a stark and unsettling introduction to the realities of the job, especially so early in my career. My supervisor's subsequent welcome aboard rookie felt like a grim acknowledgement of the horrific situation I had just faced. This isn't my story, but during high school, we had assemblies focused on the dangers of drunk driving. Officers would present graphic images of accident scenes and then hold a Q&A session. Inevitably, someone would ask about their worst experience. One officer consistently shared the same haunting story. It began as a tragically typical tale of a drunk driver causing a crash. However, when this particular officer arrived on scene, he found a young girl who had been ejected from the vehicle and was essentially severed in half, yet somehow still clinging to life. Understandably terrified and in shock, she asked him if she was going to be okay. Knowing her injuries were fatal, he lied and reassured her. He stayed by her side, even after she had lost consciousness, until the paramedics arrived. He did this because he knew this girl. She was one of his daughter's closest friends, and he knew he would have to deliver the devastating news in person the next day. I can't speak for the other students, but that officer's story deeply disturbed me every time I heard it. The image of her asking for reassurance in her final moments, coupled with the officer's personal connection to the victim, was profoundly unsettling. If you made it to the end of the video, thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share, and we will see you in the next video.